Hey everybody, it's Professor Snart here. Since we don't have our class meetings this week for Unit 7, I thought I'd do a little video that kind of walked us through basically what our unit or week is going to look like here, and then also make some comments about one particular poem from William Blake that introduces us to an idea that's going to be really important as we continue to move through our the Romantic era of our particular course here. So the Unit 7 assignment is partly just kind of, like I said in class, immersing you in the world of William Blake's poetry and art. And again, he was a really, really interesting character in the sense that he was a writer, but also a visual artist. He made his living, such as it was, doing engravings for illustrated books. So if you think about an era that didn't have photocopiers, it was no small task to publish a book with quite literally pictures in it. You had to do like a metal or a wood engraving or cut of whatever the picture was, and then print that separately from the text. So it was an interesting technological challenge at a time when lots of industries are just beginning to industrialize in Britain. So we have some of the earliest were pottery and, in fact, the production of books. So we trace mass production or reproduction, the idea that you produce lots of the same quote-unquote thing, back to very near to this time period, the late 18th century in England here. So there's an interesting collection that's curated by the British Library, and it's Blake's notebook. So it's nothing that you'd really read exactly, but I think it's interesting to look at just the way that he doodled throughout that notebook. Some of it quite graphic, some of it really domestic and ordinary, all mixed together, drafts of poems that he would write kind of next to related illustrations or next to totally unrelated illustrations. It's a good insight into his really kind of all over the place imaginative mind. And that's a nice starting place. We're going to move though into what's called the Blake Archive, which is a collection of almost all of his works that are reproduced in the full visual form. So when you're in there, there's kind of a step-by-step guide for what I'd like you to look at, but you'll see how different the work that he actually produced is from the way that we have it in our textbook. Blake has been called by some scholars the victim of textbooks. In other words, the kind of economics that dictate the way that our books are produced, right? They can't be, there's not a lot of illustrations, they can't be in color because it's too expensive. I mean, God, they're expensive enough already. And so it's interesting that the way that we experience Blake in our textbook speaks directly to some of his own impulses to counteract this booming economics of mass reproduction, especially of art. This idea that we should create lots and lots of copies of what is supposedly the same thing. Blake's whole technique for producing art, which was kind of a combination of existing techniques, interesting example of that, the old made new kind of an idea. The archive walks you through some contemporary scholars who've actually, made prints using Blake's technique. And the interesting thing to note is both how physical the process is, etching into metal that we see here, working on a copper plate here, the application of an acid that will eat away certain areas of the plate that aren't protected by this material that he would apply to it. It's like a really, really kind of hands-on, dirty, physical type of process, not just sitting down with a pen and a paper. And then the way that he would color those, which is sort of like the against mass reproduction argument here, meant that every time he printed it, and of course he was then his own printer, he didn't have to give his work to somebody else down the assembly line who would print it and color it and all that other stuff. Every time he produced copies of this, they could and would be different. So it was like a completed work, but that existed differently in each time he would print it. So it wasn't just this desire to be different or a desire to make things really difficult on himself that led him to these particular techniques. It was this sort of physical but also theoretical argument about economics at the time, especially when that came to printing in the world of art. So there's pieces then of the archive that'll walk you through that process. You'll have some screenshots of what it actually looks like from people who've done it today. And then I'm asking you in this section here to do a basic comparison, and actually the archive makes this really easy to do, to just pick one item or object, right, from that whole collection, and then when you click the compare button here after you've selected all of the all box, you'll see every version of that particular object that Blake produced. So they're very limited. Like I think he made 26 of the thing that we'd be looking at here, this general title page. And you can see how they're a little bit different. Some are really, really different from one another, but no two are exactly alike. Again, not just because he was sort of, you know, oh, it just happened that way, or you know, just this random thing that he decided to do. It was very specifically a conscious artistic choice against the idea of mass reproduction or, you know, sameness across all of these different copies. It also means that though he was, like so many artists, poor in his own lifetime, they now are, you know, incredibly valuable precisely because there's so few of them. Not his purpose by any means, but interesting that it works out that way. Okay, then an invitation to sort of browse the archive, just to like experience the very weird and mythological world that Blake created for his characters and his people to be part of. And then, as I mentioned in class, a slightly more complicated discussion board here where you are both posing questions, responding to questions, and then responding to those responses. So William Blake, like so many romantics, very, very interested in that interrogative mode, the question asking mode, not so much the declarative, this is what I'm doing, justify the ways of God to men, along that Miltonic line. Blake himself deeply, deeply influenced by Milton. In fact, one of his longer works, specifically titled Milton, is an investigation of Milton's thought and idea in this very, very strange way that Blake had of doing this kind of thing, but fundamentally to address what he saw as errors in the mythology of Milton. Again, Blake, one of those people who maybe believed that Milton was of the devil's party without knowing it. In other words, siding with those impulses that we actually see expressed in Satan for revolutionary change, of countercultural thinking, and all that kind of stuff. So Blake is just a wild figure. Okay, so that's all for you to just kind of move through. It's like a sort of atmospheric experience that I'm hoping you're getting here. But I'm going to take a look at this one object or page. See, it's even weird to call them pages because that's not really how they begin. So this is the introduction page to the Innocence part of the Songs of Innocence and of Experience collection, a collection of poems that Blake produced with the innocent side, and then very often a sort of component poem in the experience side. And what's really funny is that, again, when he would print different copies of this book, this collection, he would sometimes move a poem from one side of that collection to the other. Really interesting, right? Because his argument is almost like, even if it's the quote-unquote same poem, if I move it to a different place, it becomes a different poem. The words on the paper don't change, but their meaning does within that larger collection. So again, even in that kind of a thing, an argument against just producing the same, or things have this sort of absolute quality that is reproducible regardless of context or what they're related to. It's almost like a theory of relativity, that things are relational to one another, you know, centuries before that actually is proposed. Okay, and so this is it has the feel of almost like a sing-songy sort of a children's verse. Not because that's how Blake always wrote, but very much indicative of that sort of innocence, right? Almost a naive kind of approach to the world. A very cool page to look at, I think. We have all of the typical Blakean things going on. Lots of ornamentation, the text in the middle here, and then you can see these little figures occupying these spaces in the vines. So things aren't really proportional to one another. The vines tend to like grow into the words. On many other of Blake's pages, he doesn't render them unreadable, but the line between what is language and what is just artistic movement, like in these vines, is blurred to even a greater degree than it is here. Again, just kind of a further proof of his thinking about how language works and how we communicate with each other, and why does a particular set of brushstrokes on the page equal a word, and why does something else equal just nonsense. Thinking again that his mode of production, his method of producing these, he's actually writing these backwards to start with, so that when he prints it, right, by flipping the copper or the metal plate and then running it through the press, it prints in a way that we can read it correctly. So imagine spending your days writing backwards all the time. It must really mess with your mind. Okay. So this particular poem, though, despite its apparent simplicity, it actually invites us into one of the most fundamental questions that a number of different romantics had to deal with or wanted to deal with. We've seen it slightly expressed in John Keats's Ode on a Grecian Urn, which would come a few decades after this particular poem. This question about, like, what's the role of art in the world? Does it really have philosophy to give us, or is it just this limited representation of the actual world or the imaginative mind? What's the tension between those two things? Okay, so we have the image here of this piper piping down the valleys wild, songs of pleasant glee. This child who comes along and then laughing says to the piper. So totally fanciful, right? Just kind of this pastoral image of the artist figure in this piper, and then this child figure who sort of represents the muse, the one who's inspiring or is providing, right, the impetus to produce art, in this case a song. So pretty simple. Okay, and again, that sing-songy, very simple rhymes, that rhythmic pattern. So the child, or the muse figure, then says to the piper, who's otherwise just sort of playing this random song, he says, "Pipe a song about a lamb. So I piped with merry cheer, piped that song again, so I piped, he wept to hear." Again, it doesn't seem to have a lot of meaning, but all of a sudden the song is about something. That seems to make everybody happy. He sings it, or pipes it again, so it's not necessarily vocal at this point, it's still just that music, but it's repeatable, and now it's about something. Okay. And now the muse suggests that the piper drop the instrument, despite how happy it seems to be making everybody, and sing the songs of happy cheer. Okay, so he sung the same again, while he wept with joy to hear. So all of a sudden we've gone from this pretty happy guy just playing songs, now they're about something and they're repeatable. Now they're actually like taking on the form of words so they can be sung. They're still repeatable. And okay, everyone's joyful, but now there's weeping. So that doesn't sound totally good anymore, but where are we headed? So now the muse asks the artist figure to sit down and write in a book that all may read. So now we've moved from this very singular kind of individual expression of artistic imagination to then it's about something, it's repeatable, and now we're going to write it down so that everyone can read it. And the crux of this poem is right here. What happens at the moment that the artist sits down to write or to paint a picture or to produce this like tangible physical object, to make the imaginative vision, right, from outside of the author to some tangible, repeatable form that can be shared with others. The muse, right, the inspiration vanishes at that moment. So it's a really, really kind of like tense moment where, okay, now we can share this vision with a whole bunch of people, but we've also lost the energy that gave us that vision in the first place. Okay, so he makes a rural pen, just sort of a simple way to write. And then this is a great line. "I stained the water clear." He writes the happy songs that every child may joy to hear. So it's this moment that every artist has to deal with of taking imagination and all of the how big it is and how just sort of epic it is, but to communicate that to anybody else, to make it meaningful for anybody but the artist, it has to take this limited kind of form. And I always think of the frame of like a page that we're looking at here as a nice sort of metaphor for like containment, with the edges of the picture, the edges of the page. Once it's written down, that's kind of all it is, which sucks, but at least other people can read it now, which is great. So to stain the water clear, that's sort of a paradox. Like, staining is sort of bad, but is the water turned clear? Is it staining water that was clear, so now it's not clear? So in that one line is kind of the paradox of the whole thing. The imaginative vision to be shared by the artist has to be necessarily limited and contained to the frame of a picture, a page, you know, that one would publish so that others can share it. So for a deceptively simple poem, it communicates this really, really fundamental tension that so many romantic authors had to deal with between imaginative vision and then making that apprehensible by anybody else, and how much is lost in that process. This is fundamentally what Coleridge's short poem Kubla Khan is all about, that relationship between vision and having that take some form on the page. And so again, we cycle back to Blake's very convoluted and labor-intensive mode of production here, and how again it almost challenges that idea that in fixing something to the page it's ever really finished, because it can always be changed or colored differently or moved in the collection, again because of the way that he retained control of how those things were produced, right? He was always the one in charge of the plates and the press and all that kind of stuff, and he himself was the one who would color them. He and his wife actually worked together on that, but they could be changed. So it's like that old same but different. And that's not like a frivolous thing for Blake. That's a fundamental kind of argument against the economic culture of his time period. Okay, you never thought it was about that, did you? Well, that's all for me. That's a long video for you guys to sit through. So I hope you like the strange and wacky world of William Blake, and we'll have lots to talk about when I see you again in class.